Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. If you haven't already, please comment on the icebreaker topic, this or that. Do you prefer a phone call or a text message? We will see how many millennials are on the webinar today. I am a millennial and I will take a text over a phone call any day of the week. Our webinar today is Effective Goal Setting and Autonomy-Supportive Teaching with Dr. Omid Fotuhi. Thank you so much for joining us again. In this session, he will uncover the common pitfalls that prevent people from setting and sticking to effective goals and challenge my script just went away, and challenge common myths and offer practical and actionable practices to enhance your goal achievement. A few housekeeping items to go over. I think we all know if you do have a question, please do not hesitate to put it in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end. You please connect with us using the hashtags MCCA webinar, and we will be sending a recording of this webinar to those that registered today. I want to give a brief introduction of Dr. Fotuhi, Director of Learning Innovation with WG Labs and Research Associate at the Learning Research and Development Center based at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a research psychologist exploring and researching the processes and scientific mechanisms underlying human motivation and performance with the goal of empowering individuals to achieve their full potential. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo, after which he worked at Stanford University, where he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institution collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, as well as the Stanford Interventions Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. He has led 45 professional development workshops across the United States to help students, faculty, leaders, athletes, and corporations better understand the psychology of success and equip those groups with the tools they need to perform at their full potential. I will now hand it over to you. And which do you prefer, phone call or a text message? Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you. That's how good I am with technology. But despite that, I would still say text message these days, even though I don't get very many calls other than from vendors or people trying to sell me things or scamming me. So maybe that's why I prefer text message.
Yes, I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with you all. I think this is probably one of my favorite topics to speak about and speak on. When I was invited to be able to share this with you, I thought, wonderful. One of the reasons why I really love this work and love this topic is because of the group of individuals who are the most likely to actually sign up for these topics. If you are here, chances are you are one of those people that I love interacting with. You are one of those people who has this deep drive to aspire, to drive for more, to accomplish more, to contribute more. And you're looking for the set of skills and strategies that will help you make more effective progress towards achieving those goals. Today's topic is on effective goal setting. What we're going to do is to try to do a deep dive into some of the common pitfalls for why many people fail at setting goals and how to set more effective goals. And then we're going to quickly pivot into how we can take those insights for those of us who are educators and see how we can translate those actionable practices into the classroom setting. And so without further ado, what I'll start us off with is a quote that I like to reflect on. And basically it has to do with the philosophical question of why it is that we aspire. When you think of it, why bother? The exertion of unnecessary energy into efforts that don't necessarily ensure your safety or survival. For all we need is to be able to have access to food, a safe shelter, and yet we aspire for so much more. And the question is, why bother? This is a question that has played or focused on many philosophers' minds and psychologists alike, to try to figure out why we do this and how we can do this more effectively. Certainly there is a component of this that is culturally driven. You have some of the most achieved athletes, for instance, saying things like, no human is limited. You have some philosophers and wise thinkers that speak about the human potential. They say that the human individual usually lives far within his limits. He possesses powers of various sorts, which he habitually fails to use. Compared to with what we ought to be, we are only half awake. And so while there's a recognition that we have aspiration, there's also a recognition that many of us tend to fall short of where we would like to be or could be potentially. And again, the question is why, and why do we care? What I really am excited about is not only the fact that the work that I do, I get to apply in various contexts that have the potential for improved outcomes. So we take our work and we put it in the workplace. We take our work and we place it in the classroom setting. We take our work and we inform athletes on how to perform at the optimal level. But in addition to that, I have to say that I've been the most direct beneficiary or of all of this insight that psychology has to offer, that my own life, through the insights that I've been able to accumulate and apply in my day-to-day, has helped to augment the chances and my outcomes in terms of the fulfillment of the life that I lead. My hope is to share some of this with you. And in fact, this is something that I have made a commitment to share more broadly. We have a training program called the Adaptive Mindset Skills Training, and we cover about 11 of these skills, which really are drawn from psychology and the research with the greatest potential for impact in our day-to-day lives. So what are those key strategies, those key skills that when applied into our own lives can help us get that competitive edge? So we have a full curriculum of training that we offer. For today's purposes, due to time constraint, you'll have to excuse the small portions. We'll only focus on a relatively brief overview of some of these topics and also a subset of these topics. So the 11 modules that we typically offer, for the purposes of today, we'll only focus on a couple. And one of those has to do with how it is that we can understand the impact of our perceptions in affecting the effectiveness of our goal setting, which has to do with the way that we understand time. And the second is how to understand how we can better respond rather than react. And again, these are focused on our own individual goal setting aspirations that we'll talk about today. So with that in place, let's jump in. One of the things I like to remind people that often come to me and say, hey, listen, I know that you've been doing this work. I understand there's a lot of research, and really what I want to do is fundamentally change my life. And I know that where I am today with where I want to be is vastly different, that there's an ocean of distance in terms of that gap between where I am and where I'd like to be. Now, the good news is that in order to dramatically change your life outcomes, you don't also need a dramatically large change in your life today. In fact, it's almost like the old quote or the old joke that says, how fast do you need to be to outrun a bear? Well, you just need to be a little bit faster than the person next to you. Now, given that we live in this competitive domains, that whether in our work or in our studies, we have this calibration that occurs with our peers. We have this motivation performance that is relative to how we're doing with our peers. And so as we think about success, there's both the objective success standards that hopefully you all will have for yourselves, but there's also a relative success component that fundamentally will change our trajectories. That if we're able to sort of inch ahead of the person in front of us consistently enough, that will give us a preferential access to the opportunities that we need to be able to get the kinds of outcomes that we want in our performance domains. So, and like any sort of investment, these little benefits over a long time will actually accumulate and compound. But in order to have the long-term benefits, we do need to start thinking about how we can make those small investments now so that later in life, we have these core skills established, are part of our habit, and we don't have to think about rebuilding them from scratch. Like the old Chinese proverb, when's the best time to invest? 20 years ago. But if you haven't done that yet, today is the best time, second to 20 years ago. The first thing I want to do is really set the context from where psychology can help us inform how and why potentially some people have fallen short in terms of their aspirations and their goal setting strategies. One of the benchmarks of psychology is to recognize that a lot of our perceptions and our experiences are actually subjective. And so when we talk about reality, one of the things to remember is that reality is not necessarily the subjective thing that you and I will interact with in the same exact way. In fact, reality is subjective, and you and I seeing the same thing, responding to the same event, will actually experience very different experiences based on our past experiences, based on our beliefs, based on our response patterns. And that really is the core of psychology. And if we understand that that is the premise for how different people in similar situations will either aspire and achieve versus others withdraw and disengage, and that is the basis to understand how we can have that competitive edge by cultivating mindsets that consistently puts us at the forefront of those efforts. And one of the things that we know from psychology, as I mentioned, is that it's subjective, but it's also biased and it's fallible. In fact, there's a lot of weaknesses to our perceptions and subjective reality that we need to understand in order to sort of close those gaps to have a more efficient engagement with our lives. The fact is that this game, this inner game, is real. And if you want to have a competitive edge, you have to understand your own patterns, your own internal mechanisms, so that you can optimize on those mechanisms and perform at that level. And psychology has a lot of insights into how and why we operate in different ways. So let me demonstrate when I say that psychology is, or that reality is subjective. You might say, sure, that sounds nice, but really, how do you know that? Well, here's an example. If I ask you if you want to in the chat, tell me whether you see a bird or a rabbit. Go ahead and just by having looked at this for the first time, your first initial reaction, is that a bird or a rabbit? And please go ahead and put it in the chat. Hopefully what we'll see is that there generally is a pretty good distribution of responses, that some people consistently will see the rabbit first, while others consistently see the bird first. Now, interesting and cute, but so what? Now, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there actually are forces that can impact not only your perceptions, but how you perceive similar things, even across different times. In studies where they've shown the same image to people at different times of the year, they actually find that context matters. So if your perception of reality is subjective, then the context will also have an impact in how you make perceptions. So when they ask this question of what you see in response to this image, depending on when they ask, you actually are more likely to see one object versus the other. So if they ask closer to Easter Sunday, more people respond saying that they saw the rabbit. And if they ask closer to Thanksgiving, more people say they saw the bird or the duck. Interesting. Let's do another test. Now, again, in the chat, what I'd like you to do is, as quickly as you see it, tell me what you think the answer to this question is, okay? Are you ready? What if I told you that one of these two circles is bigger than the other? Quickly, in the chat, say, is it the orange one or the light blue one? And don't think about it, just go ahead and respond. Now, here's the answer. They're actually identical. And this was not meant to try to trick you or mislead you. But hopefully what it was able to do is to convey that even by the mere suggestion that something could be potentially different, that you for a moment possibly questioned your own perceptions, that with your own eyes, you could see these two circles, you thought they were similar in shape, and yet you questioned whether that was the case. And this is also just a representation, an illustration of how our perceptions can also be led askew sometimes. While they're subjective, there's also room for interpretation and influence that sometimes is not always in our best interests. So recognizing that our perception of reality is subjective and is influenced by the context, how are we able to rein in that mechanism to allow us to have the kind of progress and growth that we know or that we want is most consistent with our lives and our goals? In fact, that's exactly what we'll be focusing on today, is how it is that goals fit into this perception of subjectivity and psychology as we navigate our lives. Again, I have to take one step back, because in order for us to think about goals, it's hard not to talk about time. And I know I'm talking about these really big issues like reality and time, but it comes down to psychology once again. If you think about time, it isn't this object, this concrete solid object that you and I can pick up and share and use and see in the same exact way. When you think of time, despite the fact that we may have an agreement of how many hours go into a particular day and how many days in a year, time is entirely a subjective construct. And again, because that is the case, it is prone to bias, it is fallible. When we think about goals, we know that time is a big component of goals. And so if we are blind to the possibility that our goal setting is impacted by this biased perceptual mechanism of how we construe time, then again, we could be having an imperfect effort in terms of mastering our goals. Let me again take a moment to unfold what I mean by this. One of the things that we know from psychology is that, as I mentioned, time is entirely a mental construct. And as our brains are designed, we actually have a bit of a bias to view time in a slightly more proximal, myopic way, that our brains are more attuned and better designed to understand time in the short term versus this abstract long term that we haven't yet experienced, nor do we know how to quantify as easily. So I will know how much I can get done today versus how much I can get done in a year. And that's a pretty significant difference, because as we set goals, those perceptual differences actually play an important factor in whether we are able to achieve our goals and meet our goals. It also has an impact in how we are able to experience the forces of motivation internal to us. So here's an example. If I were to offer you a box of chocolates now versus if you were to wait for one more week, a box of chocolates that's twice as large next week, chances are, like most people, you would say, okay, I understand the box of chocolate next week is potentially better, but I'm actually really hungry right now. So I haven't had lunch. I had a rough day, and now I've got to listen to this webinar. I'm pretty much depleted, and that box of chocolate looks pretty tempting. And I don't think I will want it as much in a week from now when everything will be under control. Right now, though, I'm having a bad day. And so that temptation, I think is actually pretty much warranted for the exchange, albeit disproportionate or irrational. So give me the smaller box of chocolates now, and next week I won't want it as much. And yet you take this same paradigm and you ask people, now imagine this same exchange, the same agreement a year from now, which one would you choose? Would you choose a smaller box of chocolate a year from today, or would you choose the box of chocolate that's twice as big a year and a week from today? And now all of a sudden, everyone becomes irrational creatures and knows that waiting an extra week after you waited for a year and getting twice as large of a box makes perfect sense. And that's why most people will say a year and a week from now, I will take the bigger box. But right now, sorry, there's, some hunger issues happening. So I'm just going to take the smaller box, despite the fact that I'm losing out on these more efficient outcomes. So this is hopefully a demonstration of how time is subjective, but in our minds, we construe and experience time differently based on how proximal or distal it is. Our brains, as it turns out, are designed to respond to the most immediate risks and the most immediate rewards. That in the face of these stimuli, that our brains have a hot system that is designed to engage our motivational forces to respond to the immediate moment, versus this abstract long-term event that may or may not happen. So our brains are actually wired for survival to go after that berry or run away from that cougar right now. And unless we're able to appreciate that, recognize that, and give it the honor and respect that it deserves, our goal setting efforts will be undermined and diminished. So that is why we began with giving the context of how this information is important. This is a demonstration, and this is a phenomenon that's been demonstrated consistently over and over, that we have this hot and cold system, that despite our best intentions for what we think we will be able to achieve long term, when placed in the face of that temptation, that our hot system overrides our best intentions, and we actually forget what the trade-off is, or skew that trade-off calculation in favor of the more immediate temptation. Some of the earliest research on this was by Walter Mischel in the classic marshmallow studies. And what they demonstrated was that when they gave kids, relatively young kids, the option of having either one marshmallow now, or if they were able to wait, have an additional marshmallow, that a large proportion of them actually failed. The 2/3 could not wait. And surprisingly, what they also found, that when they tracked these individual students for 15 years, that those who, the minority who were able to wait, actually had all these beneficial life outcomes, that they had, they were less frustrated, they were more decisive, compared to those who could not wait. And those who waited were also more confident, more self-reliant, and they scored these massive margins higher in their SAT scores. So they were just performing better. Now, the early researchers who pioneered this work thought, here's a great demonstration of personality, these fixed and consistent traits that some people have that predicts their long-term success compared to the traits that some people don't. For instance, not being able to wait 15 minutes probably means that for a lifetime, you won't have that competitive advantage that you need to have these long-term life outcomes. Well, in recent revisions of some of this early work and looking at the footage, original footage again, what they find is actually some interesting things. That when they looked at the video of the children who were able to hold off, to resist temptation for a little bit longer, that there was a consistent pattern that they hadn't seen before. And essentially that these kids employed very specific tactics and strategies that helped to divert their attention away from the marshmallow, away from the temptation, and basically make it less tempting, less difficult for themselves. And in effect, what they were able to do was to distance their focus from the temptation, to not let the temptation consume their minds. They played with their clothes, they looked at something in the distance, they played with something on the table, or pushed their chair away, compared to those students or kids who did not were not able to resist temptation, who smelt it, who tasted it, and then consequently ended up eating it. So what this revealed is that maybe these long-term outcomes are not predictable, what we used to call personality traits, but rather that personality, rather than being a set of fixed traits, is actually more about a series of repeated states and repeated strategies. And so as we think about how we have a chance of being able to be top performers, or our potential to succeed, let us not be discouraged by this notion that there are these fixed personality traits that either predict whether we can or can't, but rather understand that there are these consistent tactics that can be employed to be able to give us a competitive edge. So some of the sort of brief summary tactics that I would recommend as you're thinking about how time plays into your goal setting is to recognize that, first of all, in the hot system, you are driven by impulse and temptation. And when that's relevant is as you think about starting to study, or starting to work, or starting to do something that's not pleasant, that you shouldn't expect it to be pleasant, right? That despite what you imagined it would feel like when you first made that plan, that when you're actually about to begin, that the emotions won't match what emotions you had when you were planning it. And that's when you have to rely on your devotion. You have to recognize that devotion over emotion is one of those strategies that you can use to remind yourself that in the moment, your emotion may not be consistent with your goals, but if you have set those goals, that takes a priority. And certainly there are ways in which your higher order functioning can override your immediate temptation. And this is one of those ways in which you can remind yourself to say, you know what, I know that my emotions will be driven by my hot system. And in this moment, when I have to put on my shoes and go out for a run in that cold, rainy day, even though I don't feel like it, this is something that's consistent with my goals and my devotion to this specific strategy. The other is to recognize the power of the context, as I've mentioned, that the context has a way of swaying your perceptions. One of the best strategies that I know of that students can use to succeed in school, but rarely ever do, is where they choose to sit in the classroom. Now, when you walk into a large lecture hall and you observe a large group of students, where are they sort of aggregated? Are they all up in the front, or is there a larger density in the back? Well, it turns out that they sit in the back. Ironically, what they're doing is they're actually literally putting themselves in a position where their field of vision can invite so much more temptation. Now they get to, in the corner of their eye, see what the other students are doing, whether they're playing on their laptop, whether they're texting each other, talking to each other. And in the distant front of the class is a small little figure that represents the teacher, whose voice is more lower, whose gestures are not captivating as much. And so why not reposition yourself so that the only thing in your field of vision is the teacher? Now, of course, I'm using students as examples here, but I know we all fall into the same phenomenon. We place temptation in our line of sight, in our line of vision. We also consistently place ourselves in positions of temptation, hoping that this magical thing called willpower will somehow come and override our hot system. And I hate to break it to you, but your willpower will consistently fail you, especially when you put it in the place of temptation. So rather than rely on willpower, recognize that the context will have an enormous power on whether you're able to implement and execute on your plans, and not hope that willpower will come in. And as I've mentioned, there's also ways that you can recognize that your hot system is indeed a very powerful mechanism, and you can hijack the hot system to keep those distal goals proximal in mind. One of the ways that is actually pretty well known and unfortunately underutilized is taking long-term goals, breaking them down to smaller goals, and putting those as tasks in your calendar. So you know you have this immediate deadline coming up on Friday that is contributing towards your longer term goals. If you rely on the longer term goal to be a constant reminder, unfortunately that falls in the backdrop of the more immediate demands that are sort of raging in your line of vision. But if you're able to reintroduce those longer term goals into smaller sections into your day to day, then chances are you'll be able to give it the priority that it warrants. Another way that you can do this is to re-articulate and remind yourself of what the potential rewards of your desired long-term goals are. So if you remind yourself that if you're able to achieve half a year of running training, that the feeling of joy and accomplishment that you'll have when you finish that first marathon will be something that will really nourish you. And so maybe there's a way that you can take that experience, that visualization, and bring it back into the day-to-day so that that becomes part of your reward system that is activated by your hot system. So when you're faced with, do I eat this additional bit of chocolate that's in front of me, or do I sort of stay in bed when I should be going out for a run? The calculation of rewards is something that's a little bit more on balance, because now you have the temptation of and the comfort of staying in bed counterbalanced with the feeling of joy and accomplishment that you might have when you actually achieve that goal. So recognizing how the mind processes time and how the mind processes temptation, there are ways that you can hijack that system to have it work in your favor. The other component that I want to mention, which is related to goal setting, has to do with how we tend to react. And potentially, as I mentioned, and is consistent with our hot system, maybe that is not the most optimal strategy. One of the things that I think is important is to understand what goals are just broadly. So there's a lot of quotes in common pop culture about what goals are and what they signify. So one of the things that you might come across is something like the significance of a man or woman is not what he attains, but rather what he longs to attain. And these kinds of platitudes about goals, the supercharging of the importance or the consequences of goals as not just being a tool that will allow you to achieve the outcomes that you want, but rather that it be a representation of your own worth as a human being, that unless you have these highly ambitious and aspirational goals, that somehow you're falling short of being a full person, that you're not an entirely fully actuated person unless you have these lofty goals. That's one thing to remember, is that because goals are such a mainstream part of our culture, there's also this influence, this implied influence of what they ought to be and how you ought to be digesting them. So one of the first cautions I have is that let's not allow ourselves to be swayed and weighed down by the weight of the consequences that goals ought to have. When you recognize that goals are actually an entirely utilitarian tool that you are able to employ in the service of your own aspirations, and if they fail to serve you any longer, that you should discard them immediately and not have this emotional attachment. In fact, we know that one of the most common reasons why people fail to set future goals is because their past experiences with having had failed goals. And in addition to that, because those goals have failed, they're also not likely to abandon those goals. So what happens year after year is they stockpile more and more goals on top of the goals that they've never achieved. I think as you think about goals, it's also important to be critical of what are the primary set of goals that you want to internalize and commit to, and what are the ones that are no longer relevant. And if they're no longer relevant, despite how much you wanted to achieve them, you must be able to, in a cold-hearted fashion, be able to discard them. If they don't serve you currently, then they're not serving you at all. In fact, they may be weighing you down. So being mindful of this component of this culture that could be contaminating your relationship with your goals, I think is an important point to mention. It's not often mentioned. The other thing that's important to recognize is that while goals are mainstream and they have this influence or aura of something bigger than they actually ought to have, that in the end, a goal is the aim of an action or task that a person consciously desires to achieve or obtain. So it is some strategy, some effort towards something that you're trying to achieve. As we know from vast amounts of literature, when setting goals, outcomes are pretty good. In fact, goal setting tends to be one of the most effective strategies to help augment the chances that you were able to achieve those goals. That absent goals, you're not as likely to achieve those outcomes as you would be. And this is pretty consistent across the board with pretty well demonstrated effects. Now, again, this is distinct and I think important to separate from how you associate with your goals. That they are not a reflection of who you are, but rather a tool that you should feel free to use or discard if they are no longer serving you, despite how useful they are or despite what culture might suggest they imply about you. And goal setting is effective for a number of reasons, as demonstrated by research. That helps to direct your attention. It helps to increase your energy, your task persistence. It helps to prioritize which strategies you leverage and which ones you don't, based on the clarity of goals. Helps with decreased stress with the ambiguity of not knowing what to focus on, and it helps to increase your working memory because now you're not constantly trying to figure out, should I put on my shoes today or not? When you have a clear goal, it really helps to free up your cognitive memory. So I don't have to convince you that goals are effective. Now, when you're thinking about goals, we've all heard that we should have SMART goals, that they should be specific, challenging, and time constrained. What's interesting, and once you start to review the original research on goal setting, is that in addition to specific, challenging, and time constrained, there's a fourth component that is rarely ever talked about, that they need to be self-generated. Now, this again might seem subtle, it might seem simple, but it's not always the case. As I alluded to earlier, that goals are sort of pushed down onto us by our society of what we ought to do and what we should be doing, whether it's our family or teachers or peers, our bosses, our mentors. There's this constant pressure of what we ought to be doing all of the time. And when you do that, you actually are working against the flow, against the power and forces that help to internalize motivation. We use goals to help us execute on what we internally aspire to do. And yet, unless we are able to be the sole authors and take ownership of our own goals, we kind of rob ourselves of that component that is key to being able to execute on effective goal setting. So as you think about your own goals and potentially the goals that you encourage your students to take on, are we able to sustain and honor the self-authorship process that goes into setting effective goals? And I'll argue, and I've seen consistently over and over again, that when goal setting practices are implemented, rarely do they ever allow for the experience of self-authoring. And so as you're thinking about how do I achieve better goals, try to be mindful of what are the goals that you truly want versus the goals that maybe are impressed upon you by society or your peers or your context. I began by saying that as we navigate our reality, that there is a subjective component that is influenced by our context. And so to the extent that you can be aware of that component and take ownership of it, then hopefully you can achieve better goal setting strategies as well. So a few insights in terms of goal setting. So recognizing that these extrinsic forces undermine intrinsic motivation. When someone tells you to set goals, it doesn't help. But there are ways in which you can internalize that process to be the author of your own goals by being the one who thinks about what is valuable in your life and being able to discard the goals that are no longer useful to you. And to be able also to understand how you can, again, take those goals, leverage the HOT system and make them proximals. Just like we mentioned earlier, these goals are only as effective as your attention is able to attribute and contribute energy towards it. So finding ways to keep them active, top of mind, is a really useful thing. I myself do like to engage in a daily goal setting morning ritual that keeps my daily goals top of mind. And it doesn't take long. It takes something in the order of 5 minutes every day. But with that 5 minutes, I probably save in the order of hours in a given day in terms of the things that I know I shouldn't be doing. In addition to the things that you do want to be doing, another strategy that I've learned and recently been applying is have not only a list of to do, but a list of things not to do. If you know that you are tempted by your phone, or if you allow email to contaminate your work during the workday, or if you maybe get off of work a little bit earlier than you should, you can be explicit about the things you do not want to do. And once you have that written contract with yourself, then again, chances are these goal setting practices can help you augment your performance. And I want to pause here for a moment because now we're about to pivot into how these insights can actually be helpful in your classroom practices. I hope throughout all of this, and I apologize if I didn't say this earlier, that you're jotting down questions in the chat where we have a little bit of time towards the end to devote to a conversation. I know I'm going through a lot. I unfortunately can't go into more detail, but I also want to not shortchange you by giving you not some of the core components that I think are crucial. And I'm happy to continue this conversation, but in the meantime, if you have questions, thoughts, feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about that. So now that we've talked about some of the key components for self-goal setting, and now let's reposition or refocus on how we can empower our students to cultivate more of an intrinsic motivation that sustains their goals. Early designs or early thinking about motivation and performance was actually born by the behaviorist researchers, where they took these animals in the lab settings, and they wanted to see how the rewards and punishments impacted their motivation and their performance. And so they would take these creatures, put them in a box, and either give them a schedule of shocks to try to deter them from doing something, or a schedule of rewards like food to try to encourage them from doing something. And what they found over time is that certainly you can create a pattern of motivation or performance that is extrinsically motivated, but once that reward disappears, so does the behavior, so does the motivation. Now, in our profession, as we're trying to foster curiosity and a lifelong learning in our students, I'm pretty sure that we would all agree that we don't want to create a dependency where students only perform as long as we are there to give them the rewards or the punishments. In fact, what we want to do is instill a strong sense of intrinsic motivation that really releases them and unleashes their potential to go out and generalize the skills and the knowledge that they learn in our classrooms into their workplace, into their communities, into the culture to create a better society. So recognizing that and trying to understand how intrinsic motivation works, some early researchers started to identify the core components of what intrinsic motivation is, which basically is What is it that drives motivation for the interest of that task and nothing else, absent any reward or punishment? Why is it that people do the things that they do? Now, one of the things to remember also is that in these more controlled and constrained studies where extrinsic motivation was the key factor in motivation behavior, that these are closed systems in which there is no escape. When these conditions are violated or no longer hold true, for instance, when you put a student in a classroom who has the option of getting up and walking away or has the option of not sitting in your classroom, again, it's incredibly important to understand how we can foster intrinsic motivation and not just extrinsic motivation. And the reason why this is relevant in learning is because learning fundamentally is a social experience that we learn by watching others, that we learn by experimenting with new identities. And if we feel efficacious and we feel that these identities are valued and regarded positively, then that is the basis for why we choose to learn and continue to learn. In fact, the core research that summarizes the key components of intrinsic motivation identify three elements. One is that we have autonomy, that we have the choice to engage in this behavior or not. The second is that by engaging progressively in a particular task, there is an acquisition of competence and mastery that gives us a sense of positive regard for our own accomplishment and our own growth. And finally, that being able to perform in this domain conveys and satisfies a sense of relatedness, that somehow we're able to take these skills and make contributions to our immediate context and our culture through the skills that we've acquired. And if you're able to find any experience that fulfills these three core needs, then you are going to have a situation where intrinsic motivation is immensely powerful. Now, as you're probably hearing me speak, you might be thinking, well, maybe I can't do all three of those entirely in my classroom because autonomy is not really something that I can fully give up to students. Well, the good news is that there really is a continuum of self-determination in which you can have a combination of extrinsic rewards and punishments that it doesn't undermine the intrinsic motivation. And it's a matter of finding that balance to maximize the levers that fulfill those three core needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence that allows individuals to sustain that intrinsic motivation. So essentially, what does that look like? In an autonomy-supportive teaching environment, you want to do three things. You want to clarify the rules and the boundaries and the consequences. So rules and boundaries and guidelines and thresholds and standards, these are not necessarily a bad thing or an enemy to autonomy. In fact, in order to have competence, you need to be able to know how to basically navigate these various levels of accomplishment so that you feel that you are making mastery. So by having clear guidelines, you're actually able to create the conditions where competence is nourished. So don't think about your classroom in terms of your structure as being an enemy to autonomy. In fact, it's not. It is the basis for how competence and mastery is fulfilled. And in fact, as we have greater clarity about what expectations are, what learning outcomes we have, how we teach the content, the greater the clarity, the greater the structure, the greater the organization, the greater the opportunity for students to have that sense of competence as they master that landscape. But if we don't have a clear infrastructure and there's ambiguity, then we find our students finding themselves confused and not able to fulfill that sense of mastery that's really at the heart of what we need to do. The second core need is relatedness. And how do we offer an experience of relatedness? Well, we listen. By listening, rather than by talking at, we're able to convey to students that their perceptions matter, that we hold them in positive regard, and that they are a valuable member of this community and this culture. The sheer act of asking questions, the sheer act of asking them to tell us what their thoughts were, or to share an insight from their own lives or a particular project with us conveys that we care and that there's value in their contributions. So how we fulfill their sense of relatedness and respect is by listening to them. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that more effectively. The third, as we've mentioned, is autonomy, right? In order to be able to sustain autonomy, you need to provide some choice. And despite the fact that we did say having clear guidelines is important, it's also important to allow some flexibility for how you're able to infuse choice in the day-to-day activities and experiences that your students have. If you're able to do all three of these things consistently, then you're able to maintain a student's sense of intrinsic motivation, and hopefully that will fuel their own desire to achieve and aspire for more in your classroom. Ultimately, what you want to do is convey that you are an ally and that you're there to support them and their goals, rather than trying to convey that you are their boss and that your rules are the rules that apply, or it's the highway, and that you are there to change them for the better. That doesn't fulfill their needs for self-determination, of autonomy and competence. What you want to do is create the conditions that allows them to feel like they are the self-authored agent of their own growth. That is our job. When you think of the various ways in which we have the potential to exercise freedom of choice, there are many things that we can give up, or at least partially, to students. If you think of your classroom experience in terms of who sets the goals, is it the teacher or the student? Who creates the content? Who designs the strategies for learning? Who is it that dictates the products that determine performance? Who determines the purpose for why you're learning? Who decides on the grading? Who determines the schedule? Who dictates the nature and the tone of the interactions? Who decides on the resources? Who creates the space? Typically, if the default is always me as the teacher, then maybe you're missing out on the opportunity to give up some of that autonomy. Maybe there is ways in which you can collaborate with your students to create some of these elements that brings in, invites, and values their perspective, which at the same time nourishes their sense of autonomy. So I'll leave this to you. There's no one right formula, but there are many opportunities that you can start critically thinking about. How is it that I can reconstruct my classroom to give greater autonomy to my students? And certainly now, more than ever, because of the disruptions due to the pandemic, we have that opportunity to really create flexible and novel learning environments and experiences without the worry that somehow we're violating some norms. You have more than ever before the freedom to experiment. And within that experiment, how much can you give up to your students? It's a question that I'll leave you with. Finally, I do want to talk about how we're able to authentically listen to allow students to feel like they are valued, that that sense of relatedness is fulfilled. Especially in current times when troubles are abound, there's no shortage of challenges and difficulties in our society. There is also a temptation for those of us in a position to be supportive, to often want to give advice. If a student comes to us and says, hey, I'm struggling with mental health, I'm struggling with a social issue, I'm struggling with time management, our desired temptation or our desire to help that student might lead to the temptation of just giving them advice, but that may not be fulfilling their need for relatedness. And again, a challenge and an opportunity is to think about, well, maybe there are ways in which I can actually just listen. And here's some effective listening strategies that are proven. So here's some don'ts. Don't give advice if you can. Don't say everything is going to be fine. It necessarily won't be the case. Don't tell them that you can relate because you went through something similar. Although I understand the motivation to want to relate, it potentially undermines the unique challenge that they feel if you say, oh yes, I've already been through that, so I get it. So don't undermine that. Don't try to explain why things are a lot better than they seem. Don't encourage them to focus on things that are going well. Don't suggest to look on the bright side. Don't give advice on how to solve the problem. And don't share stories about when things were worse for you. So these are some of the common temptations that I'll admit we all fall prey to. But if you're attuned and aware of this moment and this opportunity to foster a sense of relatedness, think about how you can really listen in a way that allows students to feel like they do feel regarded positively. And so one of the things that you want to do or keep in mind as you effectively listen is the primary goal is to try to learn and understand what your students are saying. If you keep that top of mind and that you want to convey that what I got from you or what I heard from you is a phrase that you can use to repeat what they just said so that you can articulate that A, I heard you, and B, that I'm able to reiterate what you said to me in a way that validates that I did indeed hear, is a really powerful tool in terms of being able to convey that relatedness. And if you're able to create norms early in the classroom, not in response to students coming up to you and saying, hey, I've got this problem, but early in the classroom where you spontaneously talk about your own challenges, your own difficulties, your own anxieties, your own concerns, and then you're also creating a norm of this being a human interaction, that you're not just there as a provider of content, the master in which I as a student have to try to please, but rather someone who is a partner that I can interact with, and that you have your own challenges, you have your own human emotions and your own concerns, and that makes you more relatable. So you can set the norms of being able to talk about challenges and struggles and uncertainties early in the classroom or throughout the classroom, but just not necessarily in response to when a student comes up to you and wants to be heard. Another thing to mention is, given the remote nature of all of this, a lot of the tools that we had to implicitly or non-verbally convey that we hear people seem like they may have been lost, but not necessarily. One of the things that I also do from time to time is, when interacting through a screen, I may not be able to see you, and I've got my slides here, or I may have a second slide screen that I've got to look at. But if I miss out on the opportunity to look at you, make eye contact, metaphorically, then that also is robbing one of the foundational elements for how we know we're being heard. So to the extent that you can, remind yourself that when you're speaking with students, make virtual eye contact, because that does matter. I'm not going to go through the specific example. I'm happy to share that with you. If in the slides, I do want to have some time for questions. I will say at the end of the day, what we want to try to achieve is to establish trust, that despite there being challenges or individual differences, or some struggles that we're all going through, that if you can construct a relationship that is founded on trust, that the student believes that you are there to support them, that you're also able to fulfill some of those core needs that allows them to make progress on the desire to make their own goals and be motivated on their own goals. With that, I will stop speaking and see if we have any more time for questions. I apologize if I go over. There's just so much that I want to share. But luckily, I was able to stop somewhat in time to be able to see if there's any questions here.
Yes, we definitely have time for questions. So please, if you have any, type them in the chat or the Q&A boxes. And I do have a question. Faculty, they're usually in a group setting. It's not a one-on-one. And you mentioned the importance of the intrinsic motivation. How do you suggest faculty discover that about their students? Or are you saying faculty should introduce that to their students and have them figure out what motivates them?
Yeah, so a couple things. So one of which is just how we can set norms for being able to share. So if you want to be able to fulfill and foster that sense of relatedness, you can set the norms for being able to share about your own challenges. One of the things that students assume is that you, as an accomplished faculty, have gotten to your position as a result of a sequential series of success after success after success without any deviation or any uncertainty or any feelings of imposter syndrome, which a lot of students have. But if you're able to convey that you too have had challenges, you've had deviations, you've had uncertainties, even today from an early stage, then what you're doing is you're setting the norm that, hey, I'm also human and I want to hear from you. The other thing you can do is think about how you can deformalize some of these structures that in place where you invite students to interact with you. So instead of office hours, you can say drop-in hours. Something as simple as that, instead of just having the expectation that it be this formal interaction that I come into your office only to speak about content related to the course. What if it's just a drop-in hour? Just come in and speak with me about, whatever's on your mind, what you're struggling with. Sure, we'll talk about some course content, but it's also open for our discussions. In terms of how you foster some of these motivational forces in the classroom, yes, you can totally leverage the group to help foster autonomy. In fact, if you do that, that's even more powerful. So as you're setting, as you're telling students where to sit, as you're determining when classes start, when classes end, as you're trying to determine when assignments are due, what the grading structures are, these are all places where you can, again, exercise flexibility in who determines to a certain extent how these structures are played out. And if you invite input from the class, whether it be individual or class level, then these are all factors that can foster autonomy.
We have one question from Daniel. I have a lot of developmental students these days. Giving them autonomy is difficult because they often don't know how to succeed academically. How do I balance that?
Yeah, and I never said that any of this work would be easy. The great thing about why you're here compared to someone else who's not here is because you are the kind of person that is willing to step up the challenges and that you are motivated to find ways to improve your practices. So the fact that you're here leads me to believe that you will also find ways to creatively think about, and again, we'll share these slides with you, but there are, over a dozen levers that you pull on every single day in your classroom and your interactions with your students. You can look at each one of those and ask yourself sequentially, is there some way that I can offer some more autonomy to my students? Who sets the schedule? Who sets the space where we meet? Who sets the time? Who sets the learning outcomes? Who sets the learning structure? And all of these, even to the extent that you can convey a little bit of autonomy and decision or input to the students, that will have a positive impact regardless of what their learning patterns are.
We have another. You have shared you take time each day where you're focused on your goals. Do you mind to share more about that practice?
So for me, the golden hour before my mind is flooded with distraction and demands from the world is basically in the morning before my kids wake up. I take that time and I honor it because it really is the best time to set the sail for my day. I will have a series of long-term goals that I always have at the beginning of my day timer. And of course, I calibrate them whenever they no longer are useful. I will cross one out and say, you are no longer useful in my life. See you later. And I have a little ritual and ceremony where I send them off quite happily to go on and plague somebody else or help somebody else, but no longer with me. I divorce my goals essentially. And what I do is after a quick glance at the top 2 or 3 goals I have, I now bring it into my day. And into my day, I have certainly a list of things I have to get done that day. And then I also see where I can inject or carve out some time for a little bit of progress on one of my longer term goals. And I do this routinely where I'm able to have both the short-term immediate demands balanced with some of the things that I aspire for long-term attainment that are top of mind, proximal in my view every single day. And I have a day timer that I use for this activity. It's still pen and paper that works well for me. But more than anything, it's just this designated time that I have for myself that I devote to this every single day.
Thank you for sharing that. And I kind of wanted to go back to the hot system. It seemed to me, and then you kind of touched on a little bit. It seems like it's all about your mindset, just how you view things. Am I off on that? It's kind of like, when you're mad but you have to do the dishes. Well, at least I have dishes to do over with hot water, in my home. Am I off in that? Is it all about mindset?
Yeah. I don't know that that's how I would categorize it. I think mindset's incredible. So 2 things to recognize about mindset. One is that our beliefs are malleable, right? Our perceptions are malleable, they're subjective. Once we understand, fully take that to heart, then in the moment, we have a greater sense of autonomy and control for how we're experiencing that moment. One of the things that we know is the hot system is hardwired to override whatever else is happening. So I may have the best intentions to do the dishes, but after a nice big meal, I just want to sit down. But if I'm aware that my hot system is activated, then maybe there are things that I can do in advance of the meal or in response to after the meal that will help me respond to it more effectively. One thing I do want to sort of highlight and prioritize or emphasize is that if it's between your mindset and the hot system, my money's on the hot system 9 times out of 10. So one thing, and the reason why I think it's important is, again, if you talk about if it's just about the mindset or if it's just about willpower, no, it's not. It's about an awareness of how your brain works, how your mind works, and then being proactive so that you are the driver of your behaviors, of your emotions, before you allow yourself to be influenced by the context. That's more powerful than hoping that your mindset or your willpower will kick in those difficult moments.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I also just follow up. Are you like the best parent ever with using all of this knowledge? Do you use this with your children?
If my children listened, I would say yes. But if children are like all children who, need autonomy and they want to learn on their own, and they will, like we all do, then they will certainly go through their own journey, which is really the wonderful thing about life. Certainly, I will try to share with them through example, because some of the best lessons are more caught than taught. And as we think about our own practices in the classroom, being mindful of not becoming someone who's just basically, spouting some of this advice without also practicing it, because it could land flat. Then I think there's benefit there. So take these patterns, take these skills, apply them in their own lives, and when people are ready to be receptive to it, they will absorb what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will start to wrap up. If anyone does have any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But to be respectful of everyone's time, I will start wrapping this up. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And of course, you, Dr. Fotuhi, thank you so much. We have some upcoming events I want to share really quickly. This afternoon at 4 p.m., we will have a happy hour geared towards faculty. And our topic will be about faculty burnout. It was highly suggested, so we're excited. So please join us at 4 o'clock. You have to register, of course, go to our website to do so. And then join us with your drink of choice. And we will chat with you guys, just a time to vent and open up and talk about what's going on in your campuses. And you can also mix and mingle with your colleagues across the state. On March 25th, we are hosting a panel with the female community college presidents and chancellors called Women Supporting Women. On April 15th, we have Marty Leathers with us virtually to discuss initiatives on the state level regarding workforce development. And on April 25th, our very own Brian Milner will give a legislative update. Call for proposals and nominations for this year's convention are open until April 2nd, so please get these into us soon and check our website for more upcoming events and information. We will be sending a recording of today's webinar along with the slides to everyone that registered. And again, please share the experience on social using the hashtag MCCA webinar. I don't think we had any more questions coming in. Let me make sure before I sign off. No, I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great day, and thank you again for joining us.
I'm also throwing in my email address. If anybody
Great.
wants to follow up, feel free. It's been a pleasure, and thank you all.
Thank you so much for presenting today, Dr. Fotuhi.
Of course, have a good day.